You're standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, looking at a wall of rock that drops more than 1,000 meters straight down. Now imagine someone tells you there's an Egyptian temple complex hidden in that cliff, packed with mummies, golden idols, and a Buddha statue carved into the stone, and that the Smithsonian found it, looted it, and then erased it from history. In 1909, a small Arizona newspaper printed exactly that story. An explorer named G.E. Kincaid, a shadowy professor from the Smithsonian, a secret cave 2,000 feet above the Colorado River, and a lost civilization in the Grand Canyon with room for 50,000 people. The article described mummies in stone coffins, granaries full of seeds, copper weapons, hieroglyphs on the walls, and a seated Buddha-like figure holding flowers. More than a century later, nobody's ever produced the cave, the artifacts, or a single real record of Kincaid. But the legend refuses to die. In this video, you'll see where the Kincaid story actually came from, why the Smithsonian keeps getting dragged into it, and what we know about the real human history of the Grand Canyon that this myth keeps burying. Then we'll get to the part most conspiracy channels never touch. The reason people are more comfortable with secret Egyptians in Arizona than with the indigenous history that's actually carved into these rocks. So let's open the file on the Grand Canyon's forbidden Egyptian cave. On April 5th, 1909, the Arizona Gazette ran an evening edition front-page story titled "Explorations in the Grand Canyon." It claimed that a man named G.E. Kincaid, described as an explorer and part-time archaeologist, had been floating down the Colorado River on a solo expedition when he noticed strange stains high on a canyon wall. According to the article, he climbed the cliff with a camera, reached a cave entrance, and stepped into something that sounded like Indiana Jones fan fiction written decades early. The newspaper said the cave contained a central cross hall with radiating tunnels, granaries carved into the stone, burial chambers with mummies in sarcophagi, copper tools and weapons, and vases or urns of copper and gold. It said the walls were covered in carvings and hieroglyphics that looked Egyptian, and that the statue of a seated figure resembling Buddha was carved directly into the rock, legs crossed, flowers in both hands. According to the article, Kincaid notified the Smithsonian Institution, which supposedly sent a team of 30 archaeologists led by a Professor S.A. Jordan to investigate and begin a full excavation of the underground city. The paper claimed the find almost conclusively proved that a race of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt tracing back to Ramses, had colonized the canyon in ancient times. Here's the part that makes people's eyes light up. One small article in one local paper announcing the most important archaeological find in North America. Then, nothing. No follow-up reports, no Smithsonian announcements, no museum exhibitions. Just silence. That silence is the oxygen the conspiracy runs on. Conspiracy versions of the story say the Smithsonian confirmed the cave, removed the artifacts, then buried the evidence to protect some fragile version of history. They point to forbidden zones on Grand Canyon maps, areas with Egyptian-sounding names like Isis Temple, Tower of Ra, Cheops Pyramid, and Shiva Temple, and say those labels are hints or markers for the hidden site. They insist hikers are being kept away from certain side canyons because of what's inside, not because the terrain is lethal. Now ask yourself this: if even half of this were true, this would be the biggest archaeological discovery in American history. So why is the only solid source one anonymous story in a defunct newspaper? Let's look at the parts that should be easy to check. First problem, G.E. Kincaid. The Gazette article treats him as a known figure, a hunter, explorer, and part-time archaeologist who had frequently worked with the Smithsonian. If that were real, he should leave a big paper trail. Academic correspondence, expedition logs, payroll records, something. Researchers who went looking for him found almost nothing. No birth record, no obituary, no independent mention in other newspapers, no internal Smithsonian documents, no trace of a Professor S.A. Jordan in Smithsonian staff lists. The only references to Kincaid and Jordan are in that one 1909 article and a brief notice about a Kincaid passing through Yuma a month earlier, also in the same newspaper. Here's the part nobody in the Smithsonian cover-up camp wants to explain. You're supposed to believe that the same institution that keeps meticulous records on routine digs somehow erased every single trace of its biggest discovery ever, but forgot to go back and clean up a random local article. Second problem, the Smithsonian itself. The institution has publicly denied that it ever sent such an expedition, or that Kincaid or Jordan ever worked for them. Independent historians and librarians have dug through archives looking for any hint of this project and come up with nothing. The Pima County Library System, which has written about the legend, notes that neither man even existed as far as any verifiable records are concerned. Now ask yourself this. If the Smithsonian really wanted to hide something, why deny people who supposedly worked for them even existed? Why not just bury the report, mislabel the artifacts, and move on? Third problem, the physical description. The article says the cave sits about 2,000 feet above the river in Marble Canyon, in a sheer cliff wall. People familiar with the area point out that Marble Canyon's walls are exactly the kind of vertical, hard-to-reach faces where building a giant underground city and hauling in massive statuary would be almost impossible, especially for a culture that would have had to drag everything there without modern gear. There are real ancient granaries cut into canyon walls elsewhere on the Colorado Plateau. The Nanko Weep granaries downstream, for example, are small cliffside storage rooms used by Indigenous people to protect food. They're impressive, but they don't look like Kincaid's sprawling underground city with room for 50,000 people. Here's the part that most people miss. The 1909 article reads like someone took real Indigenous cliff structures, mashed them up with secondhand ideas about Egyptian tombs and Asian statues, and cranked the dial to 11. Historians who study hoaxes have pointed out the timing and style. The early 1900s saw a wave of newspaper stunts and yellow journalism, sensational exotic discoveries, and tall tales printed as fact to sell papers. Some have linked the Kincaid story to known hoaxers like Joe Mulhattan or writers working in that tradition. The article was anonymous, sources weren't independently verified, and it showed up in a single evening edition of a regional paper, Classic Hoax Markers. The Pima Library and other debunkers suggest a simpler explanation than massive conspiracy. It was probably a slow news day. The editors wanted something wild, and somebody delivered. Here's the part nobody likes because it's boring. One old article made this up for clicks doesn't feel as fun as ancient Egyptians in Arizona and the Smithsonian is hiding it. So, why does the legend keep mutating instead of dying? Part of it is the map. Look at Grand Canyon place names and you'll see Isis Temple, Cheops Pyramid, Tower of Ra, and other Egyptian or Hindu references. Conspiracy channels point at those and say, see, the names prove there's a hidden Egyptian layer here. They're hiding it in plain sight. The reality is duller and more revealing. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, white explorers and geologists named Canyon features after mythological and religious figures from Greece, Egypt, India, and elsewhere. It was Victorian Romanticism, not a code. They projected their own obsessions onto Indigenous land. Then future generations took those names as evidence of something actually Egyptian in the rock. Here's the part that should make you pause. The same culture that slapped foreign god names onto a sacred Indigenous landscape now uses those names as proof that foreign civilizations were here first. Then there's the Forbidden Zone angle. Some videos and articles claim there's a restricted area of the Grand Canyon where you're not allowed to hike or camp because of what's hidden there. They show park maps with gray zones and say, this is where they keep you out. The National Park Service does restrict access to some areas, but for reasons that make perfect sense without ancient aliens. Sheer cliffs, extreme remoteness, protection of fragile archaeological and ecological sites. Some regions require special permits and guides, not because of secret pharaohs, but because people die out there when they treat the canyon like an amusement park. Now ask yourself this. If you wanted to hide one cave, would you really draw a big shaded box over it on the official tourist map? There's another layer people don't like to talk about. The 1909 article explicitly described the cave inhabitants as a race of Oriental origin, possibly from Egypt, and even hinted they might be ancestors of Native Americans. Around that time, some religious and pseudoscientific beliefs were trying to connect Egyptians, Israelites, and indigenous peoples in North America, sometimes to fit specific dogmas. That means the Kincaid story wasn't just random. It plugged into ideas already floating around. Ideas that made indigenous cultures' achievements look like hand-me-downs from some old-world source civilization. Here's the part that should start to feel familiar if you've watched any forbidden archaeology video. Real indigenous achievements make people uncomfortable, so they get handed to someone else. Now compare the myth to the real human history of the canyon. Archaeological evidence shows people have been living in the Grand Canyon region for at least 10 to 13,000 years. Paleo-Indian hunters, archaic foragers, basket maker and Pueblo and farmers, and later groups built dwellings, storage rooms, and ceremonial sites in and around the canyon. Tribes like the Havasupai, Hopi, Navajo, Zuni, Paiute, and others have deep cultural and spiritual ties to specific places in the canyon. Origin stories, pilgrimage sites, and sacred narratives tie their identities to this landscape in ways that go back far beyond 1909. For many of them, the Grand Canyon is literally a place where people emerged into this world. But that story doesn't come with hieroglyphs, pharaohs, or mummies that look like the movies. It comes with pottery shards, cliff granaries, petroglyphs, and living traditions. Be honest, which version do you think pulls more clicks in a world trained on Hollywood? Indigenous peoples lived here for 12,000 years and built complex relationships with the land. Or secret Egyptian tomb hidden in U.S. National Park, government cover-up. That's the real tension. The Kincaid myth doesn't exist in a vacuum. It competes with real history for attention. Podcasts like WBUR's Grand Canspiracy point out that this legend tells you something uncomfortable about the people who repeat it. It's easier for some audiences to imagine Egyptian explorers carving out a secret city in the canyon than to grant native cultures the status of primary authors of this landscape. Here's the part nobody in the lost civilization crowd wants you to sit with. If you keep looking for Egyptians, you never have to look at how this land was taken from the people who were actually here. So, what are we left with when we strip the story down? We have one anonymous 1909 article in the Arizona Gazette describing an underground city in Marble Canyon with Egyptian and Buddhist elements, backed by an unnamed writer and an unverified explorer. We have no archaeological evidence of Egyptian artifacts or architecture in the Grand Canyon. No credible coordinates, no follow-up expeditions, no Smithsonian records, no Kincaid or Jordan in any independent archive. We have a lot of modern content. YouTube videos, blog posts, and forums trading the same scans of that 1909 article, the same photos of random canyon caves labeled possible entrance, the same overlays of forbidden zones and Egyptian-named peaks. And we have indigenous communities whose real history in this place still fights for the same attention. Here's the part that actually affects your life. Every time a fake hidden civilization gets more airtime than the people who actually lived somewhere, it trains you to see the past as a puzzle built for you, not as a record of other people's realities. At the start, I told you we'd come back to one idea. Here it is. The real secret of the Grand Canyon isn't a sealed Egyptian tomb. It's how willing we are to believe in one newspaper hoax, and how unwilling we are to sit with what the canyon actually says about human history in North America. So the real mystery isn't, where is Kincaid's cave? It's, why does the idea of Egyptians in the canyon feel more exciting than 10,000 years of indigenous history? And who benefits when your attention keeps getting pulled toward the wrong story? If you want more North American legends and forbidden history stories pulled apart without sanding off the uncomfortable parts, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. And tell me in the comments which version of this canyon you think is more dangerous. The one with a fake Egyptian city hidden in the cliffs, or the one where we pretend the people who were actually here don't matter unless they look like characters from someone else's myth.